What were you saying? It's
Yeah,
allergy season.
it is. Yeah. So every like January, February, in Texas, there's like this cedar fever explosion because the ash juniper trees start to pollinate, and it's triggered by cold. And so what's interesting is that this year it was triggered by the freeze that happened in December. So it was moved up a little earlier, but it lasts for like weeks. And I've been mainlining Claritin D and Flonase and
Both my kids have it. They have we call it hay fever. I don't know if you call it the same.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, they both have it. And they really, my son especially, his eyes can fully close up. And I don't know why. I mean, I don't have it.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. Anyway, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Welcome back. Can I embarrass you?
Of course.
The last show we made at this very table
Yes.
Was my favorite show last year.
Yay.
Yeah, no, we really enjoyed it. It was a topic right at the time I was really interested in, really enjoyed it, and the feedback was fantastic. I mean, you must have seen it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I did catch some of it on Twitter. Mm-hmm.
I think the things you're interested in writing about are, you're covering something I'm really interested in that everything's kind of fucked on a political front, and there's so much polarization. I'm interested in people who are trying to bring people back together rather than separate them.
Yeah.
And so you're the last show of this sprint, the 20th show in 10 days?
Yep.
Nice.
And I've very much been looking forward to this.
Great.
Okay, so you wrote an article.
Yes.
In this issue here,
yes,
it's time to refound the American dream in the Orange Party issue.
Yes.
Why did you attack this subject?
I broached the subject because I don't think any kind of meaningful political reform is possible in the United States without moving away from the imperial tradition that has characterized our politics since at least the end of the Second World War. And I say that very advisedly because there are many peoples around the world who have counted on America exerting a kind of global policeman force. But many of those peoples have also experienced that as a double-edged sword. I say this specifically as a Polish American. So Poland, the United States, longtime allies. There's a lot of, I think, desire on the part of the Polish American community for America to continue this position of global leadership. But I see it as containing unsustainable costs, both for the United States and the world at large. And so I think there are difficult diplomatic decisions to be made, but they can begin with recapturing of the foundational American tradition of liberty, not dominion. This was very much the point of view of the Founding Fathers and articulated eloquently by John Quincy Adams in the 19th century.
Is there a connection between the US's role as like the international policeman, this imperialism, which has been largely economic? Mm-hmm. Is there a connection between that and the polarization? Or is it you're just recognizing that there's a focus required on refounding the American way, and in doing so you just have to discard because it's too much of a distraction? What is the...
There absolutely is. So you may be familiar with this phenomenon known as the Triffin dilemma.
Yes.
Yep.
But explain it to listeners.
Basically, the idea is that the United States made this kind of bargain with not all of the world, but much of the world post-World War II, that in exchange for using the dollar as the global reserve currency, the United States would maintain a trade deficit with these other countries. And that, in effect, was a program of economic uplift. It enabled these countries to earn the dollars that they could then use to trade with the United States. This was a solution to the post-World War II global economic situation where basically everybody but America was broke. And so America had, 3/4 of the world's gold and, a vast arsenal and industry, but nobody to trade with. And so this bargain enabled countries around the world to run trade surpluses vis-a-vis the United States. The problem with that is that it has decimated over time the American productive economy, particularly in manufacturing, and it has generated so much dollar surplus in other countries that that needs to be parked somewhere. And so what we've seen is the slow selling off of American hard assets, land, equity in American companies, which used to be unheard of, commodities. And in effect, what that means is we've been selling our country piece by piece to maintain this global dollar reserve supremacy.
And how has that affected the country domestically in terms of the very clear polarization that's happened now? Is that connected to this?
Certainly. So the immiseration of the American middle class is something that has been a multi-generational trajectory, and it's resulted in a lot of political polarization. People want to point fingers at culture wars, generally the easiest thing, the people that I don't like, the political tribe that I don't align with. But ultimately, regardless of who is elected, of who has been elected in the neoliberal age, that trend has not reversed. So we've seen, declining standards of living. It's no longer possible for a family to really make ends meet on a single income. I mean, it's very difficult. Spiraling costs of housing, healthcare, education, which are also connected to other factors. But in short, the vastness of resources that the United States dedicates year after year to maintaining this status as a global hegemon is actually detrimental to the American people at this point.
And do you think people recognize this? I think people recognize there's an issue. There is a problem. You're a nation becoming wealthier, but standards of living dropping. I think people recognize there is an issue with politics and media and polarization. How many people recognize this is connected to what you've said?
Relatively few. I would say this is still far from mainstream, let alone consensus. And I mean, that's unsurprising because, historically, the rise and fall of empires has very little to do with public understanding of the causes of the rise and fall of empires. Empires rise when their resource base is expanding, and they fall when their resource base is contracting, prosaically. And the people may not always understand why it's suddenly contracting. But in this case, it simply has to do with an economic trade-off decision that has reached the end of its logic.
And you're trying to front run the collapse and resulting revolution by encouraging people to consider that some kind of reform can either minimize the damage that's caused by this or point the country in a new direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think the imperative to be dominant, to be the world's policeman, has resulted in the United States conducting itself in ways that many Americans wouldn't recognize as what they consider to be American values. And we saw this, particularly after the war in Iraq, but also the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are now multiple generations of young people who have grown up with a background of constant war. Many of them have parents who served or themselves have served, and they have this sense of moral injury, which is a psychological phenomenon where they've sacrificed everything in many cases, and they don't really know what it was for. Their lives aren't materially better. They don't particularly feel safer. The global war on terror is no longer the big salient political issue that it was a couple of decades ago. Now it's the rise of China or Russia. And so there's a sense that there was a political calculus here and not necessarily a moral calculus. And I think Americans want to be proud of their country. And that starts with who you are. That starts with how you conduct yourself in the world. And when you feel constrained to always be in charge, it doesn't give you the space and the freedom to consider what might be the moral course of action.
Have you watched the series on Netflix, Turning Point?
I have not, no.
Okay, I recommend it highly. It's a four-part series, isn't it? That covers 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq. Mm-hmm. And as America's role as the world police, whether you agree with it or not, they became the target over years, generations of terrorists, whether it was the original, I think it was 1991 attempt at bombing the World Trade Center. I can't remember the exact date, but the embassies around the world, but eventually 9/11.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of sympathy for America and support behind the entering of Afghanistan. I think, and it covers a lot of the reason why that sympathy was lost with Iraq, because there was little belief or thought that this was the actions of the world police. This became more like the actions of a world's bully, and a lot of suspicion behind what happened in Iraq. And now I think there is a lot of suspicion behind any form of war. Even, I'm fully supportive of the Ukrainian people and their defense of their country, but any kind of financial support to that, there's suspicions that this is really to support the military-industrial complex. So I feel like Iraq has muddied the waters for anything America does as world police.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and one of the things I pointed out in another one of my essays about the end of the petrodollar system is that the invasion of the Iraqs happened suspiciously closely to Saddam Hussein publicly declaring that he was going to start pricing oil in euro.
Yeah.
And he was one of the very few countries in the world making that claim. And so there is certainly, I think, a way in which the petrodollar reserve system really kind of saved the United States' global economic position after the closure of the gold window. It was a Nixon administration priority to get this deal done. And so preserving that world order has been considered of paramount national strategic importance. I don't want to minimize that. On the other hand, it's like being a debtor. If this was, I believe, John Maynard Keynes, but if you owe the bank $1,000, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $1 million or, $1 billion or $1 trillion, then you own the bank.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of become, what's interesting is after the closure of the gold window, we actually sold the world our debt as gold. No other empire in human history has ever done this. We fully monetized our debt and made that the global reserve asset. But that's put us in a position where we have to keep generating more and more debt in order to prop up the liquidity of the entire global economic system. And that puts us in a terrible position because we inflate our money supply, we immiserate the middle class, and increasingly the upper middle class, and not to speak of the lower class. So it's really been a dangerous set of trade-offs.
Can we do the background to the article?
Yeah.
Can we talk about your parents moving to the US and what that experience was like for them? Because I think that sets out the foundations of what what people believe are the traditional American values and why they wanted to get into the US. Why I, as a kid, always looked to the US and wanted to come here. And I spent a lot of my time here because, by the way, there's the lens of what you see of the US on media online, but the experience, most of the time, I'm meeting people like you who represent the values, what I believe America's about.
Right. Yeah, so my parents came to the United States at the very beginning of the 1980s. They were both software engineers in an era where that was not yet as common as it is today. And they didn't intend to stay, but it just so happened that martial law was declared in Poland while they were here. they had both been active in the Solidarity movement, which was a broad coalition, like society-wide coalition against the communist state. And so they were concerned about being thrown into prison if they were to go back. And so they ended up finding jobs. And I grew up here. I was born here. I, loved it. And so, watching, my parents are like some of the most patriotic Americans like you'll ever meet. And a lot of immigrants are. They truly have made sacrifices to be here. They've never expected anything. They didn't feel entitled to it. They really came here to work and to make a life for themselves.
And they also have experienced communism.
Right. And they've seen what the alternative can be.
Yeah.
And so they, for them, this is the land of opportunity. And it has been for me as well. And so having a kind of allegiance to the values of liberty, of free enterprise, that's what I believe America to be. And that means you can't have everything. So you can't be the world police and also the land of opportunity at the same time. And that's what we've been learning slowly as a country.
Why can't you be there?
Because it costs everything. If you want to be any kind of power supremacy, costs you everything over time. This is why authoritarianism is so brittle. Because it always contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. I mean, it has to be constantly upheld and maintained. The United States spends an extraordinary amount every year on the military apparatus, and that's just the known military apparatus. We also, when you have, an apparatus as big as that, you intend to use it. And so there is this constant pressure to engage in new forms of covert and overt military conflict. And a case in point in this, going back a few decades, was after the Vietnam War, where that didn't end very well for the United States, and there were a whole bunch of CIA agents sort of out of work. Back in the U.S. stateside, feeling demoralized. And so we decided to start a proxy war in Angola and just shipped our agents there and completely destabilized this country that most Americans have never even heard of. And so, if you have a hammer, you're inclined to use it. And over time, using that hammer changes who you are. It changes your character. And so now you've traded your character for supremacy. And it's the character piece that I'm most concerned with.
So if the US was, if your thesis is correct, and as a country, it decided to reestablish its values, resign from its role as world police, how does this actually happen? What are the things we're talking about? Is it removing Americans from all these bases around the world? Because the the role of world police is something that has to come to force when there's required support and action.
Right.
When there's certain regions that are being destabilized. But there is also this kind of I'm not sure how to put it, but there's this kind of protective layer that the US has built around the world. Whether it's in Japan or trying to support Taiwan in the South China Sea, or bases in Germany, or I've seen these maps. Can you try and find that map of U.S. bases around the world?
Yeah.
Are we talking about scaling this all back and America coming back to within the confines of its own borders?
Yeah. So there's not going to be a simple way to do this, but there can be a clear-sighted way to do it.
Yeah.
There always needs to be a positive project. A negative project isn't going to work. It's not something that will motivate people or serve as a coherent rubric for action. So from my point of view, the positive project here is to be a good neighbor. And I'm literally talking about, Mr. Rogers, good old-fashioned Republican American values of being a good neighbor and asking ourselves, what does that mean? First of all, with our most proximate neighbors, with Canada and Mexico. Let's just start there. Let's just start North America. What does it mean for us to be a good neighbor to the countries that we share a border with? And then let's ask about Cuba and the Caribbean and Latin America. And we can begin expanding from there. And over time, we can, as we're guided by this philosophy or this commitment, we will begin to organically make trade-off decisions between what being a good neighbor is, finding that fit, finding that win-win for both parties without overextending, and that can guide our policy.
Yeah, because I wonder what that even means. Me and Danny were talking about this the other day. We were interviewing a guy who runs Gridless down in Africa, and he was very critical of NGOs. But a lot of the work NGOs is it good intentions, misguided intentions? How do you avoid having misguided intentions, feeling like you're supporting a country, but actually you're destabilizing it, or you're trying to change the culture of a country to something that isn't American?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with being honest about your own interests. And so being a good neighbor doesn't mean pretending that you're a selfless altruist. No country around the world believes that, America or any other country acts, selflessly on the world stage. There's always a question of interests. And this is where, I actually have a background in sales and business development. In that kind of situation, it's very clear what's going on. I'm selling a product. There's a potential buyer on the other side of the table. My interest is clear, but also their interest needs to be clear. And sales works not by strong-arming, but by finding fit so that both parties walk away from the transaction feeling like they've benefited in some way. And that's the ethic that I think we need to recover.
And no longer trying to sell democracy around the world.
Right. I mean, we can stand for democracy, but it's like John Quincy Adams says, we have to embody ourselves those democratic values. It is our example which stands for democracy, not our military intervention. And honestly, there are many countries around the world where American intervention, even very well-intentioned, has sabotaged the cause of democracy. There are autocracies that exist because, we took out the guys who we thought were the bad guys, but they ended up being the most likely vector of democratic reform. And so now there's nobody. And so by focusing on ourselves being who we espouse to be, that gives other people courage to themselves make the sacrifices that will build their own future.
Yeah, I had Alex Gladstein on here recently. We were discussing the IMF and the World Bank, and he's written a long piece discussing U.S. Economic imperialism. And he talked about how in certain countries that the U.S. would make significant loans and to help grow and support the country. But in doing so, create trade relationships where the resources of that country would be fed back to the US. He gave a few specific examples, but he often talked about these often propped up authoritarian regimes because you had corrupt people within the country willing to take the money and sell off the resources. But I also know in your article, you talked about the fall of the Soviet Union and the IMF, the World Bank, that they relied on the loans to maintain democracy. So there's kind of a contradiction between what you're saying and what Alex Gladstein has said to me. And I guess both could be true. Yeah.
So, the history of these multilateral lending institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is very interesting. They were founded in the era of high liberalism, high internationalism in the West, largely prompted by this desire to never again experience something like a world war. So, we tried after the First World War, tried again after the Second World War. And the idea was that if there was a global body that was a lender of last resort for countries that nobody else wanted to lend to, then maybe we could avoid some of, the terrible conflicts that we had seen. Now, the problem with being a lender of last resort is that that's a position of immense power. So everything you do is highly leveraged, and you can end up, just moving a little bit and squashing like an entire generation. And so the power that these institutions have wielded has been often profoundly destructive. It also has often been the only reason that, people in some countries were fed, because their governments were so corrupt that there was no no other country or private lending institution that was willing to lend to them, because they couldn't trust them. And so it's very difficult to extricate yourself from that. But it's also, if you go back further, this is part of the legacy of colonialism as well, is that many of these countries were colonies. They had independence movements, they were liberated, but their resources and their economic institutions were still entirely owned by the West. And so they had entrepreneurial politicians who knew how to advance their own personal interests amidst this web of great power politics.
It sounds very messy.
Yeah, it's extremely messy. Yeah.
And if the US was to resign from its position of world police, what are the considerations towards handing this role to China? Or not so much that I believe China would want to be world police, but by changing the power structure across the world. And we've seen with the Belt and Road Initiative that China is willing to make significant loans to countries, and those countries become indebted. They end up owning their ports or having considerable power.
Yeah.
Like, what risk is there with consideration for that? Because, my brother, I talked to him about this, and, my brother is he's very much anti-war. He marched against the Iraq War. But he sees a higher risk of giving power or changing the power structure and giving more strength to China. He sees that as a much more risky scenario for the world.
Yeah. No, I think the United States no longer being the global hegemon does not mean that there is some other country out there who would be a better hegemon.
Right.
There is, in fact, the structure of hegemony is the problem. But I would encourage you to consider this. What if, imagine that, China had a client state that bordered the United States, Mexico or something, and that they had fully militarized it. They had bases there. They would do, regular military exercises, land, air, and sea, and somehow claimed this territory as part of their sphere of influence. Well, we might rightly ask, they're all the way on the other side of the world. What are they doing here? Why are they asserting this as their sphere of dominance? And so this also gets at the Russian concerns about expansion of NATO.
Yeah.
The problem isn't that smaller countries are defending themselves against Russian aggression. That is obviously a prerogative of any sovereign state. The problem is that the United States established itself post World War II as sort of the military protector of Europe. And so European countries have indigenous defense forces, but they still largely rely on the United States for protection. And this is Putin's point, is he's basically like, if you're not militarily sovereign, you're not sovereign. And so who's really the sovereign? Well, over Europe. It's the United States. And so it's a war in Ukraine, but it's a war against the United States. This is part of, I think, there are many considerations here, but the point is that this prerogative that many Americans feel is just second nature, to just be anywhere at any time and self-evidently be in charge, that's a problem.
Yeah. I think many other countries around the world would be fearful of the US reining in its protection for other countries. But then alternatively, who's to know whether this would make the world a safer place?
Right.
Who's to know? You talked about in the article, or you mentioned you're seeing like a rise of, there is a rise of socialism around the world, or a threatened rise of socialism. Do you see this as a rejection of capitalism? Why is this happening?
The pie is growing at a much slower rate.
Right.
When does a civilization feel confident? It feels confident when it's expanding. It's expanding when the economic pie is growing fast enough that generally standards of living are being raised. People feel that they have opportunity, prospects. That trend has reversed, not just in the United States, but
we're
across the world.
experiencing it.
Yep.
Yeah, in the UK, we're experiencing it.
Absolutely. And so what happens when the pie starts to shrink? Well, people start clamoring over the existing resources, and calls for redistribution become louder. Calls for punishing corruption become louder. This often, becomes a kind of populism. People like to say right wing or left wing, but I don't really think those terms are appropriate. I think there's a kind of inchoate sense that the elites, as such, they've gotten too top heavy. And that is, in fact, materially the case. Elites consume more resources than any other stratum of the population. And as, they have children, they reproduce and they expand generation after generation. They want all of their children to be situated also as elites. And so you can't have a shrinking economic pie and a growing elite base forever. Eventually, the elites also start to feel constraints. And really, there's a historian, Peter Turchin, who argues that prior to the advent of capitalism in the agricultural world, it was actually these battles between elite factions that spelled the end of empires.
I think during COVID, during the era of COVID and post-COVID, we really had a light shone upon a separation between them and us in two ways. I think during the COVID era, we had the light shone on this kind of separation between the elites and the peasants in that. And I think it was in two ways.
Yeah.
With the numbers that were published, how some of the richest people in the world got much richer. And then we all saw, companies had to close down, bakeries, ice cream shops. I mean, we had Michael Malice in here yesterday. He was talking about how he left New York. He said all the interesting little quirky shops, they've all closed, all the cafes, the ice cream shops. We saw all that, but we also saw the ridiculous thing where there would be some kind of event, a Met Gala or whatever. Nobody was wearing a mask, but all the staff were.
Yeah.
And I think it was the kind of like this really grotesque display of separation between elites and everyone else.
Yeah.
Look, there's always going to be wage disparities. There is always going to be rich and poor. But to have it so grotesquely put in people's face, now you add to that, since then, a lot of suspicion about the truth that's coming to us. We're seeing a lot of suspicion with regards to media. I mean, Malice corrected me and saying mainstream media, call it corporate media, but there's a lot of suspicion to the incentives now. So I feel like we're in this place of, teeter on potential revolution. And I don't say that lightly, but I just think people are fucking fed up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's true.
I don't want a socialist revolution though.
Well, yeah, every revolution is messy. And revolutions tend to replace one set of elites with another. The question of whether or not they affect actual structural change that will materially uplift the condition of the people is a whole separate question. And, in some cases, redistributive revolutions have had near-term equalization effects. But the problem with mere redistribution is that if you're not generating the economic flywheel, if you're not preserving the engines of wealth generation, then you're going to just run into the same problem that the past regime ran into. And this is why capitalism matters. It's not because it's morally virtuous. It's because it's the most reliable social technology we have for growing the pie. Like before the 19th century, like net world economic growth was almost stagnant. Like most people would make the same amount like of money or resources for their entire life. And that also meant the pace of social change was much slower. But once the Industrial Revolution hits, once capital becomes a technology, you start just seeing spikes in economic growth and much faster changing standards of living, culture change, education, science. I mean, everything takes off, which is not to say that it's been great for everybody, but there is no meaningful alternative that doesn't shrink the pie.
And shrinking the pie is what leads to famine and
rolling
hunger.
revolution.
Well, yeah, and potentially millions of deaths. The reason we had Malice in was we were talking about the Soviet Union and what happened under their communist revolution. Tens of millions of people died. Was it tens of millions? Millions? Maybe a couple of tens of. I don't know the numbers, but a lot of fucking people died.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that
you can't destroy the productive class.
Right. And Lenin actually realized this. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a period of time when the Communist Party wanted to, do away with money. They dissolved the central bank. They printed quadrillions of rubles, just literally hyperinflated the currency away. People began, bartering just to go about their daily lives. And Lenin quickly realized that he actually couldn't build the Soviet Union into an industrial power without some value, some stable peg of value that could be a store of wealth and a medium of exchange. So he brought back the central banker and reestablished a bank, reissued the currency, and in fact embraced something called the New Economic Theory, which was also the model for Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China. That led it to be basically a market economy. So Lenin's thinking was that you actually had to have entrepreneurial activity. The small business, the entrepreneur, and the worker were all united in this common cause of building the socialist republic. And the early USSR actually saw some of the fastest economic growth rates in the world because they were an agrarian economy industrializing. And whenever you do that, your GDP goes through the roof because you're literally exponentially increasing your productive capacity.
So where did the Soviet Union fail where perhaps China has succeeded?
So that's a great question. And I am not a historian of either of these places in enough depth to probably answer it satisfactorily.
Okay. Can you point us where we should look?
Yeah, but I would suggest, some of the major reasons that have been identified for the slowdown in growth in the Soviet Union is interestingly around a kind of resource protectionism. So not wanting to basically be self-sufficient, which is I think a noble intention. But when your economy is growing, sometimes there need to be periods of time when you are reliant on foreign sources of whatever. There also was this phenomenon whereby the state kept plowing resources into factories that were no longer productive. So it was a kind of propping up, again, well-intentioned, not wanting these, workers to lose their jobs, these factory towns to basically become immiserated. I mean, look what happened in Detroit, or the United States, we just kind of abandoned that city. The Soviet leadership didn't want to do that because, after all, it was supposed to be a workers' party. But the problem with that is that the factories weren't solvent. They weren't able to keep up with the productive demands of a growing economy. And so eventually the state just couldn't prop it up anymore. The state does run out of resources. And we're seeing, these cascading defaults start to happen around the world now. The United States is in a privileged position because all of our debt is denominated in the currency that we print. And so there's a bandwidth that we have to kind of print away our insolvency for a certain period of time. But eventually, the question of real value always catches up with you. Is your productive economy able to support the level of debt that you have? And I would suggest the answer is no.
So can we talk specifically about China? For a country, an authoritarian country, it has been economically successful over the last, what would you say, 2 decades?
So the real kind of post-Mao reforms started happening in the late 70s, early 80s. And they've continued dramatically. And now the problem is, China's facing many of the same problems as the United States, which is that they have a tip-top elite of super rich people, many of whom have been engaged in scandals around, not paying taxes and incurred public outrage around ostentatious spending and lavish lifestyles. And so the Chinese state is really trying to ramp that in or reel that in.
Dissent also.
Right. And so this is the problem with the exercise of state power. It's always, framed publicly in these virtuous ways. We're fighting corruption, we're fighting terrorism, we're fighting money laundering, we're fighting crime. But, as we're fighting all this other stuff, we may also fight the people who are genuinely criticizing us for reasons that we need to be criticized.
I mean, Jack Ma has just agreed to step down from Alibaba. What's the wider company? Is the Alibaba the main company?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Did you see this?
I did
this
not.
week.
Ant Group.
Yeah. So Ant Group. So have you got the article? Because he went missing for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because he had been, I think, only mildly critical. Mm-hmm. And so he'd been missing for a while, probably in some re-education camp somewhere. To give up control of China's Ant Group. Jack Ma will see control of Chinese fintech giant Ant Group, the company announced following the Communist Party crackdown on the nation's tech sector that targeted the characteristic billionaire. One of China's most blah, 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 blah. But the former teacher had retreated from public view since Beijing torched Ant's planned an IPO in Hong Kong following his barbed comments about government regulators.
Yeah.
His company, yeah.
He also met publicly with Trump, which I saw someone comment recently that, in China, if you're a captain of industry, you cannot also be a diplomat. If you try to cross into the sphere of politics, it's sort of overstepping your bounds.
Yeah, I mean, but he was critical of the regulators and suddenly disappeared, and now he's back and he's going to have control of his group. It's very authoritarian, and but it's. I guess the thing I wanted to talk about is even as an outsider, we're all very critical of China, despite us, having iPhones and such. We're all very critical of China, but they have also managed to grow their economy. I mean, you said they've lifted 750,000 people out of poverty.
750 million.
Sorry, 750 million people out of poverty, and so what are the trade-offs here?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's exactly right. The question that many U.S. elected officials are asking openly now is, why can't we be more like China? And that chorus is only going to grow.
But that's actually very anti-American because all the films and TV shows that kind of refer to this may be the era of the 50s, 60s. It was are they communists? Where are the commies? It seemed to be everything America stood for was anti-communism.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And the threat of the expansion of communism around the world.
Right.
And now, I mean, I know that they're not communist anymore, even though they're the Chinese Communist Party. There is a certain amount of entrepreneurial spirit, but they certainly are authoritarian.
Yeah. There's an economist who recently wrote about how the main paradigm of political economy going into the 21st century is not capitalism or socialism, but a dirigiste economy. So that's a French term for a market economy that is centrally directed. So it's neither, full single party economic planning, nor is it free markets. It's the state is kind of the benevolent steward of the market, and takes a very active role in shaping the market. And I would suggest that, China's perhaps on a more authoritarian end of that spectrum, but most Western governments at this point aren't that different, aren't materially different. They may, in their rhetoric and in their cultural traditions, have these traditions of liberty, but in practice, the state is sort of seen as the arbiter of virtually everything, from speech to economic transacting to
gas stoves.
Yeah. I mean, like literally every little thing. And again, we talked about the hammer and the nail problem. Like, you have a huge military, you're going to use it. The political class, their mandate is to pass laws. And so they tend to approach solving problems by passing more laws instead of thinking about. I'm
sorry. Yeah. The reason I'm giving a nod to Danny, you know what I'm thinking?
It's the Mark Moss quote.
It's the Mark Moss quote. What is it?
Every new law, whether good or bad, means less freedom, roughly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unless it's a law to remove a bunch of laws. But yeah, generally speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the laws, we never get less laws. Like, we don't get fewer laws. We get more laws. We get a more complex layering of laws. And this then requires more administrators to interpret the laws and more complexity in the layers of governance that oversee these societies. And so the state gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That trajectory isn't going to be reversed through rhetoric. It actually, we need real action here, and it's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of resistance to it.
It also damages productivity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are
absolutely.
To say that you don't get the removal of laws. I remember I was out in Wyoming with Tyler Lindholm, and he was talking to me about licenses. It's like, you have to have a license to be a hairdresser. I was like, why do you have to have a license to be a hairdresser? Either you can cut hair or you can't. And I think, you do get periods of, would you not argue deregulation is a removal of regulations?
Perhaps, but they're the exception.
Yeah,
not the rule.
There's a net. I mean, Eric Voorhees, one of my very first interviews, he's a libertarian, talked about, the size of the state. He said, I'm not even asking for the abolition of the state, or can we just get 1% smaller?
Right.
Can we just get, just a little bit, and then maybe target 5%? But yeah, the nuclear industry has been hamstrung by regulation.
That's right.
Certain things with even what I do in the UK, like certain rules are holding back my business the ability to get bank accounts. I'm now actually being investigated for buying a house because I've sold Bitcoin in the past. There's so many things like that get in the way.
Right.
But how do you get these reforms? Because I'm with you, Natalie.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you do it?
So I think there has to be a generational turnover in leadership. And that in itself, that's sort of necessary but not sufficient, because...
Why, though, a generational turnover in leadership? Are you talking about the political class?
I am talking about the political class, yes. Because I would suggest that the current generation of political leadership has been formed under a paradigm of geopolitical relations and economic, let's just say political economy, that is profoundly in this direction of good guy American king, dirigist state economies, a sort of top-down federated system of control that ensures that the world functions smoothly. Well, that's a very coherent picture, and it's comforting. The prospect of a more decentralized, multipolar world is terrifying to many people in the current generation. And, even the people who do lean more libertarian, I think the younger generation hasn't inherited the assumptions of the post-war order. They're entirely digitally native. So the world is at their doorstep and has been at their doorstep from childhood. They have known nothing but economic crises and a shrinking of prospects and lowering of standard of living. And so I think they're open. But the question is always open to what? And this is why there has to be leadership. There have to be people, voices in the public sphere who are speaking in terms of character and not just of getting yours or getting revenge against the bad people who took things away from you. No, who are you going to become? What are you going to build? What are you going to invest in and sacrifice for? That's the world that you're going to create.
We seem to have very few people of that kind of character and quality about at the moment. Because, I mean, you talk about a turnover, a generational turnover of the political class, but we do see people are entering the realm of politics, new, interesting. You can believe they want to change. You can believe they stand for something, but they seem to get co-opted by the system very quickly. The incentive structure, the horse trading that goes on behind scenes. I mean, we talked about it the other day. And, this, whatever you think of Matt Gaetz and his questionable dating, he appeared to be standing for something,
right?
And he got a little whisper in his ear from the Godfather and changed his vote. So I wonder how difficult it is to get anything done because the incentives of the system are completely screwed.
Yeah. Well, this is the problem, is that even the revolutionary voices or the rebellious voices are themselves beholden to an authority structure. It may be a mirror image authority structure of the one that's dominant. But this is very much like, the sort of dichotomy between obedience and rebellion that is such a cultural trope in like teenage life or growing up, putting on the leather jacket and, showing my parents that I'm independent by rebelling. Well, you're still acting in reference to their authority when you're doing that. You're just now opposed to it rather than for it. And people who ping pong between obedience and rebellion their whole lives never actually individuate. And so what I'm talking about is a kind of cultural individuation where you become autonomous. You act without reference to authority. It doesn't mean you don't have authorities. It doesn't mean authorities don't exist. There are always going to be authorities. It's a social technology. But you are an autonomous, individuated human being who navigates authority structures.
So I kept a note earlier when you talked about Reformation, refounding the American dream based on traditional Republican values. So I'm bringing that up because you said, there is so much polarization.
Yeah.
To sell in reform based on traditional Republican values, on a person by person count, you may be losing plus 50% of the nation, certainly close to 50% of the nation. And I think some people might say, no, the problem is we haven't evolved from traditional Republican values and the world has changed. How can you ever get reform when the reform is based on one political wing?
Yeah.
Are there not traditional American values that span Americans?
Absolutely, yeah. And when I said that, I was being somewhat tongue in cheek.
Okay. I mean, look, when I think of traditional American values, I think Republican. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's kind of been the brand. This is why every Democratic presidential administration basically governs like a Republican administration from a policy standpoint. I mean, there really is no meaningful difference, I would suggest, between the parties on most issues. There are a few issues where there is a difference, and for some people, those are the issues that they will vote on forever. But there is absolutely a bipartisan consensus that is basically has shoehorned politics into different flavors of the same thing. And so when I invoked Mr. Rogers earlier, I mean, he was a minister, a Republican, but he never talked about politics on his show. There was nothing political. He was coming out of the era of children's theater, puppet theater, where the interest in the developing child was considered to be central to building the character of the next generation of American citizens and their friends. And so, there's a real, I think, openness that has been lost. America is a nation of immigrants. A lot of people believe that genuinely on all sides of the aisle. America is a diverse nation, but there's a kind of culture of hospitality that I think has a spiritual center. In his case, he was a man of faith. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be a religious person to have this conviction, but the openness of heart, the willingness to reach across difference with the understanding that you and the person across the table will forever be different. The goal is not sameness. The goal is doing something together. That's what a shared project is. And that's the only reason that America matters from my point of view.
Yeah, we had a guy on the podcast last week, Vivek, I can't say his
Ramaswamy.
name. Yeah, Ramaswamy. We're not sure we 100% agree with him. Danny, you would be a little bit more skeptical than I am. Mm-hmm. Well, I brought up the polarization, and he said there isn't really a true left-right divide. The mm-hmm. real divide is between the management class and the citizenry. Mm. And when he talks about the management class, that could be from within politics, within large tech companies, the people who get to make the decisions. And there's mm-hmm. this kind of collusion that happens between them that we saw with, some of the Twitter files that have been released.
Yeah.
And like my comparison to that is in the UK, the nurses have been on strike recently. Mm-hmm. And they're all very similar people with the very same standard of living a very similar life, but they are struggling with the rise of inflation and rise of cost of living, as nurses, and they want a pay rise.
Yeah.
And when they're on the picket line striking, it doesn't really matter what party they represent.
Right.
They actually have the same goals, the same kind of objectives, the same things they want to do. And I do wonder how much the incentive models of politicians and media is divide people who genuinely are kind of on the same team.
Right.
So whether I agree with Vivek or not, I do recognize that actually there are a lot of people, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you're being punished the same way by a broken system of incentives, but you're being tricked into creating the wrong enemy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and what's funny about this is that, this was Marx's analysis of the German ideology in the 19th century is that this is how class politics works, is it works when the elites exacerbate cultural divisions between the working class to prevent them from recognizing their shared interests as, in fact, the majority and the people who produce most of the value that the managerial class siphons off. And so, the question is not so much as, the managerial class or the capital class or the elites, are they like evil? Do they serve a purpose in society? They do, clearly. There has to be an executive function for personalities of a higher order, for human collectives to move in a certain direction to produce value. The question is the distribution of rewards, of economic rewards, proportionate to the value that's created?
Nope.
Right. And this is why we have, what some would call class struggle and what others would call, simply freedom of contract. If you as my employer are not compensating me adequately for the labor that I provide, I'm going to go elsewhere. And the problem is when the managerial apparatus, either of the state or of the private sector, gets so heavy that people can no longer meaningfully exercise that freedom.
Same with the truckers.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's why, in some ways, sometimes I'm like, I should just stay away from politics. But I'm so interested in it because I'm interested in the solution. Mm-hmm. I think so many people focus on what divides us, separates us, and then, support this machine. And perhaps I've done it at times myself. But I'm always looking out for the people who are like yourself, who is looking for a solution, because this is so utterly broken and it's not benefiting hardly anyone.
Yeah.
This is fragmenting society. It's causing division. I just fucking hate the whole thing. But that's why I was, I find Andrew Yang so interesting. I disagree with him on UBI, right? Absolutely disagree with him on UBI. But he's at least going, we need something different. Even Brett Weinstein, what was he started to try a new political party. He had an idea where we would get somebody from the right and somebody from the left and form a party together. We get some strength from both sides and get them to work together. These, whether these ideas are naive or work, it's at least there are some people with strength out there saying, we need to fix this and change this, which is why I want so much more out of Elon Musk. Like, that's the kind of person who you think just, stop being captured by the audience, like make a difference.
Right. No, and this is actually the caustic nature of the celebrity culture that we inhabit now. It'll fry your brain. And this is one of the things that I myself, am careful of. Like, every public appearance that I make is something that I treat with great respect. It's like a wild animal, because you don't want it to wield you. You want to be sure that you are wielding your public personality, and that you are in service to the organizations and the people that you're responsible for.
So there's a wild Natalie Smolenski under there that we if we prod in the right way, we will get you to explode.
any kind of amplification, whether it's through celebrity or power or money, is you're dealing with wild forces. And if you don't know yourself, then they will own you. In fact, you will own yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's the big issue with, like, we notice with audience capture. Once you're captured, getting yourself out of that position is very difficult because, again, back to incentives. Your incentive is to, your incentive is to dog whistle the audience you've created. But I had it when I was with Eric Weinstein. We did this interview we're in LA, and he said, discard 10%. Let's get rid of 10, 20% of your audience now. Let's insult them and get rid of them. Like, keep shedding your audience. Keep willing to let them go. Say things they don't want to hear, because then when the audience you have is going to respect you for the honesty of opinion, and they're going to trust you and you have integrity. So many people out there have just been captured. Tim Paul's always a great example for me. I just think he's become a dick. And that's going to piss people off on this, but he is so captured by his audience that he dog whistles them the whole time. And I think I have the strength to go, okay, I like some of what you say and some of what you don't say. I think other people don't. Yeah. And so those people add, and by the way, people criticize the mainstream media. These people are making the same mistakes. They're doing exactly the same fucking thing. that someone like Tim Paul will criticize the mainstream media. And I'm like, you've got the same playbook.
Right.
You've got the same incentives. You want to separate your audience. You want to dog whistle. You want to build up this kind of rabid following, and you're contributing to the same problem. It really pisses me off. Anyway, Natalie, what is the answer?
The answer is the slow, hard work of coalition building and character building in a shared project. And that's the question. What is the American project? And I would suggest that the American project is one of prosperity and opportunity, regardless of who you are or where you come from. If you have an entrepreneurial spirit, whether you're generating capital or knowledge or any other form of innovation, you should be welcome here.
Is that not true anymore?
I think it is, but less and less so. I think it's becoming harder and harder for either people born in America or who immigrate to America to make it. And that needs to be fixed.
So you can come here, but like making it, is that also a barrier?
Right.
What are the barriers that are up?
Well, we have a very Byzantine and bureaucratic visa process that routinely just leaves thousands of people, highly qualified people, either out of the country or forces them to leave, unable to set down the roots that they need to meaningfully build something here. Meanwhile, we have immigrants leading like the top 10 technology companies in the United States. And so there's clearly a mismatch between our need for talent and our ability to import the talent that we need to sustain the engine of economic growth. And then, for homegrown talent, the challenge is, one often of economic hardship and an education system that mirrors the hardship of the local communities. And so these are vicious cycles.
And that visa system, would you say that's just a function of more laws, more rules,
right. Yeah.
more bureaucracy?
No, exactly. And there's a lot of political grandstanding around immigrant visas because, political administrations want to appear tough on immigration or, like they're prioritizing American jobs, jobs for Americans. But the reality is, and actually Elon Musk has spoken about this, is that economic prosperity, generally relies on either like rapid population growth or a lot of immigration, because you need to generate the productive capacity, and that's your human capital. And so if you have a shrinking population and you're not replenishing kind of influx of fresh talent, then your economy will contract over time.
And does this also become political? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but immigrants are more likely to vote Democrat.
I think there are certain groups of immigrants that are targeted by, whatever the hate message of the day is. But I would say immigrants on the whole are extremely diverse. I grew up in a community of immigrants, many, from all over the world. And I would say the vast majority of them voted Republican.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not a function of the geography where you're from.
It is to a certain extent. It's also a function of profession. There are certain professions that tend to vote Republican or Democrat. That may have changed, since I was growing up in that community. But these are, when we talk about party affiliation, we're talking about culture. People are often Democrats or Republicans in the sense that they're, Methodists who go to this church, or, they're, from this particular neighborhood. And so this is why I'm actually hesitant to label people.
Yeah.
Because I've spoken to people with very different party affiliations, who agree on issues that they would never think they agree on. But for cultural reasons, they can't be seen together or affiliate with one another.
God. Okay. Can you help me just understand just some historical context? Back hundreds of years ago when America established the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the forefathers were debating it, were there still two... how was the political divide then? And how were these issues debated?
Do you mean around power projection outside of the United States?
I'm literally, no, just within the United States. When the forefathers were debating the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and I know there were certain things that were written anonymously, but during that period, the people, because I am clueless to this, the forefathers themselves, were they Republicans? Were they Democrats? Was it a mix?
So those parties didn't exist.
Okay, so what existed then?
I would say
North
that,
and the South.
I mean, there were profound geographic divisions. So the main question in like the early American Republic was, to what extent are we a coherent project, a coherent state? There was a lot of opposition to the Constitution for the reason that people in all of the different states were suspicious that a federal government would rob them of their liberties. And each state had a very distinct culture, a distinct history, like reason for formation. Like literally different populations were sent there or chose to immigrate there from Europe. And that created different state cultures. And so there was the sense that every state was sovereign. And, much like in the European Union today, that joining this larger federation would result in a compromise of state sovereignty. And so actually the anti-federalists were just as vocal and popular as the federalists were. And in many states, ratification of the Constitution happened through like some really strong armed tactics, like people being tarred and feathered and like physically like beat up in public. It was a violent era. And so, there was a question of, is America a country? Like, is it a coherent project? And eventually the Federalists won. I would suggest, though I'm not a historian of this era, because the logic of common defense was still so fresh. There was still the sense that if we didn't unite, if we didn't at the very least share in armed forces, we were vulnerable to being, taken over again by our former colonist or colonial power, or perhaps a different one,
or civil war.
Right. Yes, certainly that was a concern as well.
Or state by state conflict.
I think probably more pressing was the concern that, we just liberated ourselves from the British Empire, but they could be back. And in fact, they were back.
Right.
And so we need to hang together. But like Washington wanted to dissolve the military. He didn't believe that the United States should have a standing army. And this is why in the Constitution, it makes reference to well-regulated militias. This notion that, citizens should have the capacity to defend themselves. They should be ready, but it needs to be a citizen army, not a professional standing army. That is an instrument of tyranny. And look where we are now.
Yeah, when we had the Brexit vote for the UK to leave the EU, I really struggled with the decision because as a Bitcoiner, I was like, well, independence is better, smaller states are better, yada, yada. Yeah. But I really struggled with the decision. I ended up speaking to one of my friends, and he said the great thing about the EU is it's one of the most successful peace projects the world has ever seen. Mm-hmm. We have not gone to war in, countries in the EU have not gone to war. We've had war in Europe, we had the Balkans, but countries within the EU have not gone to war with each other because we are united. We might disagree with each other, but we're united. And so that's always kind of like weighed heavily on me. And that's, for all the bureaucracy and the inefficiencies you get, the fact that you remove that incentive for war is kind of, it's a big reason to vote to remain because I don't know, it just feels like the right thing to do. I'm not really going anywhere with that, by the way.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is that there was an economic friction that was removed in trade between European countries that did create a kind of rising tide of prosperity that incentivized the people to keep the peace.
Yeah.
However, that there was a trade-off there. You created a larger administrative class in Brussels, who then could dictate terms to every member of this union.
Brussels and Strasbourg. Do you know about the EU moving to Strasbourg every month for 3 days? Do you know about this?
Okay, tell me.
Okay, so I won't get the details correct, but in the establishment of the EU, I think it was the French disagreed with the idea that it would, be placed. It would just exist singularly within Belgium, and so the compromise was 3 days a month. The entire EU. They literally in lorries. They pack everything up. They move to Strasbourg for 3 days. They operate there for 3 days and they go back. I think the cost is like 150 million. Have you found it?
I'm just having a look now.
Yeah, I think it's at the cost of 150 million a year. Yeah, here we go. Your EU Parliament's 140 million a year moves to Strasbourg. A waste of money, but would it ever be scrapped? So we want the history. Can you scroll down a bit more, Danny? The EU Parliament's triangle of locations, Strasbourg, Brussels and Luxembourg, were formed to balance the original smaller European Union. Among the costs accrued by the monthly relocation, however, includes transportation for thousands of parliament officials, political groups, parliamentary assistants, and freelance interpreters, in addition to paperwork that is transported by trucks between locations. In March, plenary resolution of the EP budget, it was noted that the environmental impact is significant, stands at between 11,000 and 90,000 tons of CO2 a year, the equivalent of driving between yada yada. I mean, it's just fucking ridiculous. They literally move it. You can understand why they argue through it at the time, but I think we're in an era where that is unrequired. But yeah, it is. There's a lot of inefficiency there.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned coherent state. Would you say it's an incoherent state now then?
Well, there are significant incentives to maintaining the integrity of the U.S. state. One is, much like the European Union, interstate commerce. I mean, if there were to be a breakup of the United States, the complexity of, setting up bilateral trade relations between all of the states would make doing business in any of the former U.S. states prohibitive for a lot of companies. And again, this common defense, it's maybe it's not so hard to imagine the United States fending off a Chinese invasion. It's hard to imagine Mississippi fending off a Chinese invasion. And so there are, in terms of economy and military sovereignty, really strong reasons to cohere. The question is, what beyond that should the federal government do? And I think that's really where the open question is.
So maintaining a common defense, there's a solid and good argument for that, but removing the power or the amount that the federal government gets involved in would make the country more efficient. It would make it less imperialist, and that could lead to, how much of a common goal do you need? If as long as you have strong states' rights and states' decisions, people have the ability to move and live where they want anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a question of to what extent do we maintain the state apparatus that we built? Like, just to give you a sense of this, there are currently 18 federal intelligence agencies.
18.
Like they've been exponentially kind of growing. Like there's a hockey stick curve. And that's not to say anything of all of the, federal, basically police, law enforcement agencies, and then the state law enforcement, municipal, county law enforcement. So that there's this massive and growing police apparatus that exists at all levels of government. And to what extent, do people in Texas, for example, need to be subsidizing with their tax dollars, all 18 of these intelligence agencies? I don't know.
I'm not sure how to close this one out.
Let's open it.
Well, yeah. Like I said to you, what next? You said build a coalition, but part of me thinks maybe things have to get worse before they get better. I think, I don't know the answer. Like, I'm totally intrigued by this subject, but I'm massively out of my depth adding to it because I'm not an American. I don't understand historical context. There's little I know about it. What you're going to have to close this one out for me, Natalie. What question do you put out there?
No, I would like to end with an invitation to your listeners to consider what it would be to build liberty. What does that mean as a positive project? Over the next few years, one of the reasons that I do research into political economy is because I would actually like to turn these principles into a set of actionable policies that something like a political, not necessarily party, but movement can form around. And this is why I'm actually genuinely inspired by the Solidarity movement that took down the communist state in Poland. I grew up, hearing stories of this, and it was very much alive when I was a child. This was a coalition of right and left and people of different religions and atheists all across the spectrum to suggest Self-determination is something that's worth fighting for. And I think that spirit of solidarity can be rekindled again.
Can you lead it?
Well, I'm out here trying.
I mean, you have the historical context with your parents. It would feel only right that you were to carry that torch on here in the US and drive forward that solidarity.
Absolutely.
Well, you would have my full support and backing, and the limited resources I have to help you. I hope you do it. I'm so sick of it. I'm so sick of it. I'm regret anything I've got involved in that is drives polarization. I've got zero interest in it anymore. I just care about trying to bring people together. I don't want to say it in a Lex Friedman, everyone, but at the same time, like, there is something to be said for that. Like, we need to bring people together.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning.
Yes. Me and Danny are going to be looking for out there looking for the Natalie Smolenski solidarity movement.
Yes.
Creating solidarity between the left and the right, and hopefully ending this bullshit. Natalie, I was well out of my depth today, but I absolutely love talking to you and listening to you talk about this, and I wish you all the success. Where do you want to send people?
All right. So txbitcoinfoundation.org.
I owe you some money.
Oh, well.
No, I do. I've totally forgot about that. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to send you some money.
So we want to do, we're already publishing the Satoshi Papers. This is the first academic journal. We're bringing together historians, economists, social scientists, philosophers to write about why Bitcoin matters for human societies and for state-society relations specifically. So that book is coming out and by the end of this year. And then we also want to do some fun events. Like, we want to engage people. We want to bring like some really smart people who aren't necessarily Bitcoiners, but who write about the stuff that we've been talking about today. Because I think Bitcoiners are some of the most intellectually curious people that I've ever met, and they're hungry for this. So let's do it.
That was the question I didn't ask. I forgot I have a Bitcoin show. What does the role of Bitcoin play in this solidarity?
Well, it's a reminder that all power is not top down from the state. In fact, value is an emergent phenomenon. It emerges bottom up as individual people opt into something that is better than what they're currently living. And so what Bitcoin is, first and foremost, is an alternative. It's a new way of imagining. It's a new way of relating. People have forgotten what a freedom to transact means, that I can just pay you for something without having to involve a third-party intermediary, without having to prove my identity to some panopticon, without having to demonstrate that I'm a good and loyal subject. No. The government is subject to me. I am the source of sovereignty. You are the source of sovereignty. So let's take that back.
Yeah, honestly, I should show you this email afterwards.
We've got our quote for the opening of the show, I think.
Yeah, I think we have. So in buying this house, right, I have to send 6 months of bank statements and prove I have the funds in my bank account. And now I've got my solicitors combing over all my private transactions and questioning them. You know, obviously there's Bitcoin transactions in there. There's, you know, and they're asking me what it's about, what it's for, can I prove it? And it's such, you know, not only is it invasive, but it's like, why? I'm not a criminal here.
Right.
What the fuck have I done wrong?
Exactly.
You know, surely, I mean, if I was American, surely this, you know, would be against the Fourth Amendment. Yeah,
Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, that's search and seizure, isn't it?
Well, this is the thing. These constitutional rights are meaningless.
You need a new constitution.
No, we need a leadership class with the character to live by it.
Integrity.
Yes.
Wow. Integrity and politicians don't go hand in hand. Natalie, listen, I absolutely love talking to you. You can come on this show whenever you want. Me and Danny will have you whenever, whatever you want to talk about. Anyone listening, go in the show notes, read the article. Please go and check out the previous interview we've done and remind what's the name of the association?
The Texas Bitcoin Foundation.
That's it, the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, of which Danny will remind me to make sure I send you some money to support everything you're doing. Happy New Year. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.